The judge has taken the bench. The first witness of the day has just taken the stand. DNA analyst Charlene Webster. Let's get you into the courtroom.
Hello, Ms. Webster.
Hello.
Will you please tell us your full name and spell your last name?
Yes, my name is Charlene Webster. Last name is spelled W-E-B-S-T-E-R.
How are you employed, Ms. Webster?
I am a senior crime laboratory analyst with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement at the Tampa Bay Regional Operations Center in the biology section.
How long have you worked for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
Since December of 2009.
Okay. Will you tell the members of the jury about your formal education, please?
I have a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology and a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry from the University of Miami. I also hold a Master of Science in Pharmacy with a concentration in Forensic DNA and Serology from the University of Florida.
Thank you. Will you also tell us a little bit about the duties and responsibilities of a senior crime lab analyst?
Yes, as an analyst, I examine items of evidence for the presence of body fluids such as blood, semen, or saliva. I also examine them for any skin cells that may be present from items that may have been handled, touched, or worn. I will take samplings of those items of evidence to try to develop a DNA profile that I can then compare to the DNA profiles of known individuals that are believed to be involved in the case. I will put a statistical weight if I'm able to do that and produce a report.
What is DNA?
DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is the genetic blueprint for life, and it makes us who we are. Your DNA profile is unique, except in the case of identical twins. You inherit half of your DNA from your biological mother and the other half from your biological father. Your DNA is found all throughout your body, so except for mature red blood cells, and your DNA doesn't change over your life. So the DNA I would find in your hair would be the same DNA I would expect to find in your blood.
What method of DNA analysis do you use up at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement's office in Tampa?
We use STR testing, which stands for short tandem repeats. And STRs are just small segments that are found throughout the DNA. The number of times those repeating segments are observed varies from individuals. And as I mentioned earlier, since you get half from your mother and half from your father, the number of repeats you get from each person would vary. That process is done in 4 steps. So what I'm going to try to do in the first step is I'm going to take that sample of the evidence and I'm going to place it in a tube. I'm going to add some liquid and some heat, and the purpose of that is just to try to break open those cells so they can release the DNA so I can see what's available to me. The second step is then now to make many copies of the 21 locations on the DNA strand that I'm actually looking at. And I'm trying to make those copies so that way I can get a better idea of the DNA profile. The third step is now, the second step I misspoke was determining how much DNA I actually have present. Once I open up those cells, how much DNA is available to me. The third step is making millions of copies of the 21 locations on the DNA strand that I'm looking at. And then the last step is just separating those copied DNA by size, so that way I end up with peaks on a graph, much like an EKG. And those peaks are your DNA profile for each of the 21 areas of the DNA I'm looking at.
Right. That method that you just described, short tandem repeat, is that supported in the scientific community?
Yes, it is.
By published scientific literature?
Yes.
Okay. Now, your lab in Tampa, is it accredited?
Yes, we are.
With whom is it accredited?
We are accredited by ANAB, which is the American National Standards Institute National Accreditation Board.
And as an individual crime laboratory analyst, do you have some sort of continuing education or accreditation that you have to do personally?
Yes, I do have to do 16 hours of continuing education each calendar year. In addition, I do have to take what's called a proficiency test twice a year. A proficiency test is just a scenario-based test that's given to me from an outside agency. I know I'm being tested, but I don't know the results of the test. Once I receive the samples, I will take the samples from start to finish, just as I would any other case working sample using our standard operating procedures. Once I get my results, I submit it to the testing agency, who then ensures that my results are consistent with theirs, and they will report that back to ANAB, our accrediting body, and to FDLE as well.
When was the last proficiency test that you undertook?
Earlier this year, and I passed it.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. How do you talked about your protocols. How do you ensure that the results that you achieve in your laboratory are correct? How do you know that you're getting the correct results? What steps do you take?
We have controls that are run with all of our samples. So as I mentioned earlier, as a part of that STR process, that I took a sample of the item of evidence to do through the 4 steps. Well, I'm also going to do that with what's called a reagent blank. So it's just an empty tube, and everything that happens to my sample happens to that tube through all 4 steps of the STR process. That's called a negative control, and that just ensures that no outside DNA is being introduced into the samples. In addition, there's also a positive control that's run through the samples to just ensure that all of the reagents are performing and the instruments are performing the way that they should and producing the expected results that is received from that positive control.
Right. As an analyst, do you maintain neutrality when you are working with items that have been submitted to you by various agencies and throughout the testing process?
Yes.
Why is it important for you to maintain a neutral attitude about the evidence that comes into you for testing?
When I receive the evidence, I don't know what to expect as a result, so I'm just going to conduct my testing as I would with every other item that's similar. I'm going to send it through the same process, of course not to be biased in any way, just to perform it and to try to get any DNA profiles that may be usable in the case.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned a little bit earlier about statistical analysis is used as part of the procedure for ultimate DNA analysis. Do you have specialized training in statistics?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the training that you've received in statistics?
So I took statistics as a part of my master's class. In addition to during the training program at FDLE, we are trained on the statistics that we perform, which is currently likelihood ratio. In addition to the training that I received from FDLE, the members of the program that we use also did a 2-week statistical training class on the system, and so I did get that training as well.
Does the Florida Department of Law Enforcement use a particular database as part of your statistical analysis?
Yes, we do.
Can you explain a little bit about that database, please?
The database we use is developed from, the National Institutes of Standard and Technology. That database was published in the Forensic Science International Journal of Forensics in 2013. And basically that database contains DNA profiles from random people who were samples that were purchased, and the DNA types that were observed there are just telling me how common or how rare a particular allele or DNA type may be observed in the general population across 3 ethnicities. The ethnicities we look at are Caucasian, Hispanic, and African American, as those are the 3 common ethnicities found in the state of Florida.
We are listening to the DNA analyst on the stand. Let's go ahead and bring in criminal defense attorney Josh Schiffer. Josh, talk about why a DNA analyst is important. In this situation, there's no confusion here. The defense counsel said his client did it, so they bring in a DNA analyst. The state has to prove every element of their case linking the defendant to the crime. So kind of talk about that.
Yeah, so basically the state, no matter how hard or easy a case is, still has mandatory checkboxes that they need to fulfill. And part of that involves the introduction of evidence, making sure that now and in the future, the introduction of that evidence and acceptance by the court is as bulletproof as possible. And that's why very good DNA techs are familiar with how to introduce this evidence, as well as how to introduce a jury to something that's admittedly pretty complex. You can dive real deep into DNA and go far beyond the average ken of people in the community. We don't need that, but we do need to ensure, as a state, or the state does, that the jury understands the basics of the science, can trust the science, and squash out any of the potential avenues to contest the DNA that a defense may bring up. Now, we don't believe there's going to be much of a defense to contest when it comes to DNA in this case, but it's still very important that the jury is fully informed as to the reliability of this science and how the DNA techs arrive at the conclusion that they're able to testify to as experts.
Josh, as a seasoned defense counsel, do you even cross-examine a witness like this?
You really need to play the emotions of the jury and kind of your presence in court by ear when you get to this. Some juries in some rooms, you feel that if you don't say anything, maybe you're not doing their job, and you give a couple throwaway questions. But then there's also really legitimate issues even with accepted science. Accepted science, we accept it because of the scientific method, which says that you should be able to repeat these results time and time again, no matter where you are. There are legitimate queries when it comes to the DNA science, how it's applied, how that it doesn't have perfection built in, because no scientific process is perfect. There's always that ability to have an extraneous data set, something that comes in that upsets the theory that the state's trying to get the jury to agree with. But I certainly wouldn't attack this kind of witness. You do need to maintain the professionalism and don't want to offend a jury by being over the top.
Yeah. Definitely. Josh, thank you. We're going to squeeze in a break. More of this case we've been watching out of Sarasota County, Florida, when we return.
Mama tried. Now my daddy's crying because I'm in here.
You are the common denominator that led to JD and Big Doug shooting each other in the dark of night.
I helped right now, I'm dying.
Don't you have the blood of both these men on your hands?
I felt guilty for that.
You felt guilty because, frankly, you were guilty.
Interview with a Killer. New episode Saturday night at 8 Eastern and Pacific. Only on Court TV.
Back now to Sarasota, Florida, where we have been watching day 2 of testimony in the adopted son murder trial. Defendant Dima Tower faces up to life in prison if convicted for the murders of his adoptive parents, Jennifer and Robert Tower. Right now, we are listening to testimony from a DNA analyst. Her name is Charlene Webster. Let's get you back in for more of her testimony.
Why do you use a numerical weight or a statistical weight as part of the DNA analysis?
We add a statistical weight to a sample that is a match, which means that I compared a single source or profile from one individual to a known individual, or an inclusion where I'm comparing an individual to what's called a mixture, where that's from 2 or more individuals. It gives a statistical weight as to how common or how rare, given the DNA evidence, how likely it is to see that DNA evidence how likely it is to see that that DNA evidence given the profile that is observed let me rephrase that. The statistical weight gives I'm looking at the DNA profile and I'm comparing a known individual to the profile, either to a single source or a mixture. It just gives weight as to how common or how rare that DNA profile may be observed. Sorry.
Okay. Essentially, does that allow you to put into perspective the results as to how much of that person's DNA is in that particular sample?
It's actually just saying it's comparing it's comparing two different scenarios and giving a weight. It's comparing how likely that DNA profile could be from the person of interest or an unknown individual. So it's not telling me that that person is actually in the profile. It's just telling me what is the likelihood that the evidence could be from the person of interest versus an unknown individual.
All right, thank you. Now, have you ever testified in court with regard to DNA analysis?
Yes.
How many times, approximately, Ms. Webster?
Probably about 50-ish.
Okay. And can you give us an idea of where in the state of Florida you've given testimony on DNA?
I've gone as high as Tallahassee, and I've gone as further south as Fort Myers, where we have our different regions. So any of the courthouses in between there, I've probably touched on a few of them.
All right, great. Now, I want to ask you about how, as an FDLE analyst, how do you determine or examine an item of evidence to know if there is blood on that item? Can you explain that process to us?
Yes, if I'm examining an item of evidence, I'm going to look at it to see if it has red-brown staining that may be possibly present, as that's somewhat characteristics of what a blood stain would look like. If I observe red-brown staining on the item, I'm going to perform what's called a presumptive test, which is just a chemical change test that tells me whether or not blood is probably present, but what it possibly isn't. I cannot confirm that it is blood, but I can say that blood is possibly present. That color change test takes a clear liquid, and it turns pink if blood is possibly present.
Okay. Did you receive known samples in this particular case of the defendant Dima Tower and also Jennifer and Robbie Tower?
Yes, I did.
In what forms did you receive those known samples, Ms. Webster?
I received a buccal swab from Dima Tower, and I received a blood stain card from Robbie Tower and a blood stain card from Jennifer Tower.
Okay. Now, as to the buccal swab from Dima Tower, did you obtain a complete DNA profile for Dima Tower?
Yes, I did.
And as to the blood stain cards, did you obtain complete DNA profiles for both Jennifer Tower and Robbie Tower?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so did you also receive items of evidence, or did your lab receive items of evidence from the Northport Police Department?
Yes, we did.
Can you please tell the members of the jury, and without going through the entire list, if you could just tell us about items 6.1 and 7.8.
May I refer to my notes?
You may, if it would help to refresh your recollection.
Item 6.1 is described as a DNA sample that was taken from the knife blade.
Okay, and 6.1, was that derived from a kitchen knife?
Yes.
Thank you. And then as to item 7.8, can you tell us what that item of evidence is?
Item 7.8 is described as a DNA sample from knife 6's handle.
Okay, thank you. All right. So speaking specifically of those two items, 6.1, the knife blade, and 7.8, the knife handle, and those are from two distinct knives.
That's
Am I
correct.
Thank you. Okay. Did FDLE test those items?
Yes, we did.
Okay. Can you please explain the initial results of that test?
Item 6 is the kitchen knife did give chemical indications for the presence of blood. That means I did that presumptive color change test that I described earlier, and there was a color change for pink. So the results that it gave chemical indications for blood.
All right, and what about 7.8? Just as to the blood, the serology.
That's yes. So there was, I also did obtain, there was chemical indications for the presence of blood on item 7.8 as well.
Thank you. Now let's go back to 6.1. Once you found the chemical indications for the presence of blood on that knife blade, what was the next step in the analysis?
After that, I would have taken there was a sampling taken of the knife handle and the blade, and then the samples would have been placed in a tube that I described earlier and taken.
Coming to the top of the hour and coming up, more testimony from the adopted son murder trial for Dima Tower. We're coming right back. You're watching Court TV, your front row seat to justice. And welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Kelly Craft. We are in Florida this afternoon for the adopted son murder trial. Jennifer and Robbie Tower adopted Dima Tower when he was 14 years old from a Ukrainian foster care. But soon, their new son would start to exhibit violent tendencies. And just 7 years later, Jennifer and Robbie Tower would be found dead. Prosecutors say that Dima went into his parents' bedroom on the night of August 31st, 2023, just days before his 22nd birthday, and began brutally stabbing them before fleeing the scene. Let's get you back into the courtroom now. We are hearing from a senior crime lab analyst.
Through that four-step process, as I described it, in order to try to develop a DNA profile for each of those items.
Okay. And what were the DNA results that you obtained from the knife blade, item 6.1?
So for item 6.1, the knife blade, the DNA results obtained demonstrated the presence of a mixture consistent with 2 donors, including at least 1 male contributor.
Okay. And were you able to determine of any of those donors in that particular item, 6.1, the knife blade?
I was able to include Dima Tower as a possible contributor to the mixed DNA profile. The observed mixed DNA profile is approximately 61,000 times more likely to occur if the sample originated from Dima Tower and 1 unrelated individual than if it originated from 2 unrelated individuals.
Okay. Were you also given an indication of one of the other donors in that mixture?
I was able to include Robbie Tower as a possible contributor to the mixed DNA profile. The observed mixed DNA profile is greater than 700 billion times more likely to occur if the sample originated from Robbie Tower and 1 unrelated individual than from 2 unrelated individuals.
Okay, so if we can break that down just into layperson's language, can you just simplify that for the members of the jury?
As I mentioned in the statistic, it's giving a weight. The type of statistic I'm giving you is called a likelihood ratio, and it's comparing 2 opposing hypotheses. So it's comparing whether or not the person of interest could be given the DNA profile, the person of interest could be the donor of the profile versus if an unknown individual could be the donor of the evidence profile observed. In this case, I'm giving weight to whether or not for the evidence, if Dima Tower is included, the likelihood for the DNA profile is approximately 67,000 times more likely to occur if it originated from him versus non-related individual. I'm giving weight more to each of those scenarios, and it's on a sliding scale. So if a likelihood ratio of 1 just means that it's neutral. It doesn't give weight to either one of those scenarios. As you get higher above 1, the number 1, it gives weight more to my first scenario of the person of interest being the possible donor of that DNA profile. As it gets lower from 1, it's stating that it's supporting more of that second hypothesis, or that an unknown individual is the one that donated that DNA profile.
Thank you. Now let's move on to the knife handle from 7.8, the other knife, the second knife. Can you please tell us about the results after you did your analysis, Ms. Webster?
The DNA results for item 7.8 demonstrated the presence of a mixture of at least 2 donors, including at least 1 male contributor. A complete DNA profile for the major contributor could be determined and is suitable for comparisons. Due to the limited nature of the DNA results for the additional contributors to the mixture, that data wasn't interpretable. So I'm only making comparisons to the major DNA profile. This major DNA profile matched the DNA profile from Robbie Tower. The observed major DNA profile is greater than 700 billion times more likely to occur if the sample originated from Robbie Tower than from an unrelated individual.
Thank you. Now, I just want to ask you a question regarding this particular evidence. So these knives were in a kitchen, and presumably they were used by all the members of the family at any given time. The family members being Robbie Tower, Jennifer Tower, and Dima Tower. So what distinguishes the DNA that you found on these 2 knives? What's the distinction? Is it because you found chemical indications for the presence of blood as opposed to touch DNA?
Objection leading? Yeah, let's try not to be
All
so
right.
leading in your question.
Thank you.
Do
So-
you understand the question as a general concept? Can you explain touch DNA versus blood DNA? Okay, I think that's the question.
Please.
Yes. So if blood DNA from blood, blood is as a body fluid in general would produce more DNA or leave more DNA behind than just touching an item. However, I can't say in this case as to which one those came from, as the knives may have been handled as stated by everyone throughout the family. I can't state whether or not the DNA is exclusively from blood or from epithelial cells.
Thank you. But based upon your analysis, were there chemical indications for the presence of blood on both knives?
Yes, there was.
Thank you. May I have a moment, please?
Amen.
Thank you very much. I don't have anything else.
Mr. Gilman, when you're ready.
Good morning, ma'am. How are you?
Good morning, and well yourself.
All right. So when you're examining these items of evidence, you examine essentially what's submitted, right?
Correct.
You don't go to the individual law enforcement headquarters and pick and choose what they give to you.
That is correct.
All right. So if they give you, for example, an actual physical knife, you would go through and do all of the swabbing yourself, correct?
Correct.
If they don't give you the physical knife, they just give you whatever the swabs are, you test from the swabs, correct?
Correct.
So you're entirely at the discretion of what is submitted to you as far as what gets tested.
Correct.
All right. And that system is automated, correct?
What do you mean by automated?
I mean, you don't go in and with like a pair of tweezers and pull out DNA, right?
No, I don't use a tweezer to go in. I do the process that we described.
Right. It's automated through machinery, right?
Yes, there are some hands-on portions, but yes, there are some machinery that helps with that.
And the peaks and valleys are essentially computer-generated results, correct?
Correct.
All right. The statistical analysis that you do has changed since you started in 2009, hasn't it?
Yes, it has.
Okay. And it used to be that you would give numbers like 1 in 15 and make like sounding like really horrible made up numbers for a statistical analysis, correct? And you'd have to count the number of zeros to describe the number?
Yes, we still do that. There's still big numbers now.
Okay, but it sounds to me like you said that the 2 times that you discovered Robbie Tower's DNA, that statistical likelihood was 700 billion times more likely, correct?
I stated that it's greater than 700 billion times more likely.
Okay, and then for the one instance where you indicated that you found Dima Tower in a mixture, it was 67,000, correct?
Approximately 61,000.
Okay. I think you said both 61 and 67, so it's 61?
It's 61,000.
Okay. And that's obviously closer to zero than 700 billion, right?
Yes.
Okay. And again, we're talking about a mixture, correct?
Yes, for both samples.
And using the statistical analysis the way that you do, if you were to use a separate database than the one that you use, would you expect similar or different results?
Objection calls for speculation.
Would you be speculating, or do you know the answer to that?
I generally know the answer to that.
All right, I'll overrule the objection. You can answer it.
It would be slightly different, but I wouldn't expect there to be more than a 10-fold difference.
Right, so back when you're talking about the big, huge numbers, if we're talking 700 billion, the 10-fold difference would be 70 billion, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Nothing further, Judge.
State any redirect of the witness.
Did you find blood on those 2 knives?
Yes, I did find the indications for blood, yes.
Okay. And in addition, did you also find DNA from Robbie Tower and Dima Tower?
I was able to include Robbie Tower and Dima Tower on item 6.1.
And is that the bottom line of your report? In the most simplistic reductionist terms, is that the bottom line of your report?
Those are the results of my reporting, yes.
Thank you very much.
Is the witness free to step down?
Yes.
No objection.
All right, you may step down now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Folks.
As they get ready to bring in the next witness, let's bring in our guest for this hour to discuss. Joining us now from St. Paul, Minnesota, criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Jack Rice. Jack, great to see you as always. Let's talk about the cross-examination. What do you think the defense was trying to get at there?
It's real interesting. You're looking at the numbers, and the numbers are huge, Kelly, obviously. But I think in the end, what you're going to see from the cross, certainly during closings, is to make the distinction, and I think this is where it'll go, is that they're going to try to make the distinction that there was DNA, and that DNA certainly could have come from the young man himself, from Dina. But at the same time, this was a knife that was a household item that anybody most likely would have touched in the first place. And so trying to make the argument that just because his DNA was on there doesn't mean he was the one holding the knife as it was being used as a murder weapon. And I think that's where they're going to try to go.
And you know, Jack, so when we had a situation in this case where defense counsel has said in opening statements that we don't dispute the facts, we know that he did it, he has said that he did it, so then why cross this witness? Why cross that DNA analyst?
It's a wonderful question. I always appreciate being on with you for that very reason. Because when you're thinking about cross-examining anybody, you're doing it to drive your narrative. If your narrative is that he did it, he actually committed the act, but for some other issue, maybe it's a mental illness question or it's something else, then the purpose of trying to go after a witness that undercuts your own theory doesn't make sense. As a result, it would have made more sense in my mind to actually not cross-examine this witness because you're not disputing it. You're not saying that what that person said was wrong. Instead, what you might have done was said, when you're studying DNA, when you're looking at DNA, you obviously don't have the ability to determine emotion, to determine what drove somebody, to determine whether somebody was mentally ill, to determine whether or not somebody was having a schizophrenic attack, anything along those lines, to say just because he did it doesn't mean that he's not guilty by reason of insanity, if you're going to make an argument like that. That's far more consistent with the narrative.
Yeah, not guilty by reason of insanity. Let's go for manslaughter instead of a situation where this is a young man who premeditated this, which is, of course, what the prosecution is wanting with that first-degree murder charge, 2 of those.